This year marks 400 years since the landing of the Pilgrims at Plymouth. Ah, the Pilgrims. In school, we dressed up like them. They sailed on the Mayflower and started Thanksgiving, kinda. But who were they? Well, as far as who they were name-wise, it's all the names scrolling on the screen right now. Less specifically, they were the Brownists, not Puritans. Puritans wanted to purify the Church of England, whereas Brownists were the followers of James Brown. No, seriously, it was Robert Brown, and they didn't like the fact that the Church of England was state-run and non-attending was actually illegal. So they just wanted to be left alone to start their own church, and certainly not one with blackjack and hookers. By the way, for a few hundred years, rather than be called Pilgrims, they were actually referred to as the Brownest Immigration. And that would be the Brownest Immigration, not the Brownest Immigration. That would be the Atlantic slave trade. When James I took over in 1603, yes, the Bible King James, and yes, the gunpowder plot of 1605 King James, things didn't get much better for the Pilgrims. Yeah, it got worse if we're being quite honest here. Archbishops like Richard Bancroft and Tobias Matthew fired sympathetic priests, shut down churches, only to restart as separatist or Puritan churches. Yeah, you kind of missed the target on that one there, guys. They imprisoned and fined anybody that didn't follow the Church of England, and pretty much made it clear that if you didn't like the Church of England, well, you could just get out. And so that's what the Pilgrims did. They fled to Holland around 1607, 1608, somewhere in there, moving to Leiden more specifically. They set up a congregation, and some found jobs, though others had a difficult time either finding work or finding work that wasn't backbreaking, low paying, and caused health issues. The children were also picking up Dutch customs and ideas which their parents did not like, and some couldn't afford to live there and were forced to return home to England. This was all going on during what was known as the 12 Years' Truce, which was a truce that lasted 12 years, yeah, imagine that, during the 80 Years' War. Now, the Dutch and Spanish were itching to get back to fighting, and the Pilgrims were worried about what would possibly happen to them under the Spanish. But then England stepped in and offered the Dutch aid, but in return they wanted the Dutch to make the English religious congregations that had moved over there illegal. Seeing this coming and knowing that they needed to find somewhere new, they looked for places to settle, including one in South America, and they were actually really interested in the idea of being able to be missionaries and spread the word to new people. They had heard stories of failed colonies in the New World, but they wanted to give it a try anyway. So, after being approved for a land patent by the London Company, which was a government-established company basically in charge of settling North America, it was decided that William Brewster would lead the colonists on their way and that they would take two ships, the Mayflower of course, and the Speedwell. You don't hear much about that one though, it kept leaking and was left behind in England. Also keep in mind that it was only a small part of the congregation that was going to the New World, and many of the passengers weren't Brownists, but rather were hired by investors for the trip. 120 passengers headed across the ocean, losing 2 people and adding another as a child named Oceanus was born. After 65 days of sailing in November of 1620, they came to the New World, but the weather was colder than they were expecting. Seems it's hard to plant crops when the ground is frozen. And illness had struck the ship. Roughly half of those on board died from scurvy and or leptospirosis, which typically came from rat urine. After exploring the area, they decided on a site near an abandoned village. The indigenous inhabitants had all previously died, probably from smallpox, and the Plymouth colony was born in modern-day Massachusetts. What would become Massachusetts? It wasn't Massachusetts at the time, but you know what I mean. Oh, and they pretty much lived off of corn that they were able to dig up or steal. Well, not corn, maize, and 2 things. 1, not corn, maize, and 2, corn and maize are the same thing. So yeah, corn and some types of beans. And eventually they had the first Thanksgiving, which was basically just to say thank you to the local tribes who taught them how to survive so that they wouldn't starve to death, and then they went from there. So in short, the Pilgrims were Brownists that wanted to live somewhere where they weren't forced to follow a state religion and could spread their own. Plus, you know, corn and pumpkins.